Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please return to your seats. If you're still writing questions, please continue to do so and pass them to the ushers. We'll go ahead and begin with the question and answer time. The cards, as we requested, that you mark A or C for Ayala and Craig. We will alternate between Ayala and Craig. The person who the question is directed to will have 2 minutes to answer the question, and the other participant will have 1 minute to respond as well. So, without further ado, Dr. Montan will begin with the first question.
Let's have the first question for Dr. Ayala. Given what you know about the speed of the evolutionary process, do you think that the age of the Earth, which geologists estimate to be about 4.5 billion years, represents a reasonable amount of time for the genetic code of a simple organism, say a virus, to evolve into the genetic code of a human purely through random mutation and natural selection? And if so, on what grounds do you believe this? And Dr. Ayala will have 2 minutes to reply, and Dr. Craig will have an optional 1 minute to comment.
This question is a question whether I believe there's enough time, and the answer is yes, there's plenty of time. But I don't know what else how else can I elaborate. Evolution under natural selection can happen relatively fast, one step at a time, but and they accumulate over time. 4,500 million years is a lot of time. And life on Earth probably started only about 3.7 million years or so, which is still a lot of time to give rise to humans and to also other sorts of organisms. So, unfortunately, I don't know what else to add other than answer yes, it's enough time. Obviously, I don't have the time to try to develop an argument of how evolution can proceed relatively quickly, other than some of the examples that I have given, which are simply illustrations.
You have an optional 1 minute.
Yes. The Cambrian explosion, in which all of those basic animal groups or phyla appeared on this planet, occurred around 547 million years ago. And so we've got to get this amount of biological complexity from those basic phyla in that amount of time. And you remember the estimate that I gave from Barrow and Tipler, that 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of them is so improbable that it would take the entire stellar evolution of the sun to occur before it would happen. That's about 10 billion years. So each of those steps would take around 10 billion years to happen by these mechanisms. So all of the evidence that I'm aware of, at least, is that these would not produce this kind of biological complexity in this amount of time. If evolution did occur, if common ancestry is correct, then it must have been guided by some kind of a supervising intelligence that directed it toward this end.
Okay, question now for Dr. Craig. It's a logical fallacy to assert that lack of evidence for one theory constitutes empirical evidence for a contradicting hypothesis. Simply arguing that macroevolutionary change is too complex and too extraordinarily improbable to occur through natural selection does not prove the viability of intelligent design. What clear empirical scientific evidence obtained from peer-reviewed experiments is there for intelligent design?
I'm really glad for this question, because it's important to reiterate that I did not argue tonight that intelligent design is true. I said it's viable. And in the case of these mechanisms, if the mechanisms have not been demonstrated to have the efficacy to produce this kind of biological complexity in this amount of time, then it does seem to me that ID is at least viable. It deserves a place at the table, and that's all I was arguing for. Now, in terms of arguing for its truth, it is again a caricature of these ID theorists like Dembski and Behe to say that they argue, well, because random mutation and natural selection don't work, therefore intelligent design is true. That's not the way they argue. Remember, Dembski gives two very specific criteria for a design inference: extremely high in probability and an independently given pattern. And if something exhibits those two characteristics, then a design inference is justified. So this is not an appeal to fallacious either-or reasoning or ignorance. This is a principled inference based upon defended criteria. So to deny the inference, you've got to either attack the criteria and show why they're incorrect, or else you've got to show that biological systems don't meet the criteria. But let's have none of this claim that we're dealing here with an argument for an ignorance or God of the gaps. That simply ignores the way in which these ID theorists frame their arguments.
So the improbability argument and the argument of independent conditions to demonstrate it was shown with my very trivial experiment with bacteria. You have 10 to the minus 16 probability just in 4 days, and conditions created externally, completely independent of the biology of the bacteria. Let me say one thing that has suggested to me by some of what Dr. Craig has said now and before. You know, in terms of the complexity of life, what is most complex is the development of the cell and the various kinds of cells. So for the first nearly 3 billion years, we have only unicellular organisms, and then we have the Cambrian explosion, then multicellular organisms appear. You know, we have groups of organisms where we have multicellular organisms, are called volvox, for example, that are very similar to unicellular organisms, and we have measured the number of genetic differences, going from one cell organism to a multicellular organism with cell differentiated by being some reproductive, some otherwise somatic, takes 4 mutations only. Okay. So it can be accomplished very readily.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. For Dr. Ayala, how can you say that God is not the designer of organisms while still saying that you believe in God? What do you think then is God's role?
What was the first part? How do I say that God...
How can you say that God is not the designer of organisms while still saying that you believe in God? What is God's role in your opinion?
I don't know what is the problem. I think the problem is the other way around. Now, depends on what you mean by God being the designer of organisms. Let me give you an example of an experiment I have done, and by the way, Richard Dawkins did many years ago very similar. You make a computer program where little pieces can come together according to certain rules and make more and more complex creatures, and they have different relative rates of reproduction or multiplication depending on the attributes that they have. So you design the program, and you end with multiple kinds of little organisms. These are all computer creatures. I have not designed the organism in a way, some other way. I have designed the organism. I am the designer of the program. This is one way to see God as the creator. Doesn't have to be there designing the organisms and putting these other things together. And in fact, if I run the program again, comes with different outcomes. So once again, one can see God as the designer of the universe. I can see God as being my creator. I'm a creature of God. But that doesn't mean that God took the little cell in my mother's womb that was fertilized by my father's sperm and had to intervene to develop the grown-up Francisco Ayala that I am. So I have come about by natural process. That's not incompatible with my being created by God.
I think Professor Ayala's position is a consistent one. Even special creationists, as I said, don't think that God created every single species just as is. They may think that God created, for example, a primordial dog, and then all the dogs evolved from that, or he created a primordial bear or a certain type of lizard, and the others came from that. So God is the source of all these things, but doesn't mean that he immediately made them all. So I think his position is quite consistent. But I don't think that it solves the theological problem of evil, because you still have to ask the question, why would God choose to create things through a process which is so filled with waste, death, pain, and suffering along the way? Doesn't this call into question God's goodness? And there I think you have to revert to some sort of animal pain theodicy, such as I offered in my last speech.